The Killer Bee True Crime Podcast, Episode 6, Part 1. Edmund Kemper, the co-ed killer. Due to the graphic nature of this killer's crimes, listener discretion is advised. Ed Kemper detested his mother. She belittled him, mocked him. She refused to show him affection. She believed it would make him behave effeminately. She drove away his father. She drank heavily. She forced him to sleep in a dark basement, away from the rest of the family. Ed's hatred for his mother consumed every waking thought. He dreamt about beating her, stabbing her, killing her. He even dreamt about defiling her corpse. For years, his anger festered. It grew into a monster that controlled Ed's every waking thought. Ed Kemper killed his first victims at age 15, on August 27, 1964. He later killed 8 women, between 1972 and 1973. He stalked the streets of Santa Cruz, California, killing and dismembering female hitchhikers. But he became most famous for killing his own mother. After he was captured, he did interviews with the FBI. Agent Robert Ressler helped build the FBI's serial killer profiling program. This relationship is portrayed in the Netflix series Mindhunter. Edmund Kemper III was born in Burbank, California, December 18, 1948. His parents were Edmund Kemper II and Clarnell Kemper. Both his parents were tall, standing over 6 feet. Their marriage ran on short fuses. Ed remembered his mother being a domineering and demanding woman. His father, who went by E.E., was passive and timid. His mother constantly demeaned and mocked his job. He was an electrician. She thought it to be menial and unimpressive, and especially compared to his former career. E.E. had been a soldier on the front lines of the battlefields during World War II. After the war, he continued to work with the military. He tested nuclear weapons in the Pacific. E.E. told Ed stories about suicide missions, bombing runs, and the military life. Ed's respect for his father grew exponentially. Ed hated his mother's disrespect for his father, and he said his mother was emasculating and was born from a place of man-hating. Ed also seemed to think that some of his mother's treatment of him and his father were motivated for a desire to raise Ed as a, quote, real man. Clarnell often denied any signs of compassion, and when E.E. showed any care for the boy, she derided E.E. for coddling their son. Clarnell feared that showing any affection for young Ed would, quote, turn him gay, just like the ferry boy who lived down the street, end quote. Clarnell's strict efforts to keep Ed from becoming passive and timid like his father had the exact opposite effect. Despite being extremely intelligent, young Ed performed poorly in school. His shyness and abnormal height resulted in him being bullied by his classmates. He was bullied at school and bullied at home. He became increasingly disconnected from the people around him. That included his 2 sisters, Susan and Alan. In 1957, E.E. had enough of Clarnell's constant viciousness and divorced her. E.E. later said the suicide missions in wartime and the atomic bomb testing were nothing compared to living with her. It's likely that Clarnell harbored some resentment toward men, and that she unleashed that resentment on her husband and son. This seemed all the more plausible when we consider the fact that Clarnell treated the daughters extremely well, and her daughters considered her a good mother. A psychiatrist that analyzed Clarnell's personality after her death believed something else may be the cause of her extremely unpleasant behavior. They believe she may have suffered from borderline personality disorder. The National Institute of Mental Health says that borderline personality disorder is a mental illness marked by an ongoing pattern of varying moods, self-image, and behavior. These symptoms often result in impulsive actions and problems in relationships. People with a personality disorder may experience intense episodes of anger and depression, anxiety that can last from a few hours to a few days. These intense periods of negative emotion correlate with Ed's memory of his mother. When she would chastise him or his father, he remembered her repeatedly yelling about things for days at a time. When she wasn't yelling, she would withdraw from their presence and hardly speak to them at all. The National Institute of Mental Health states that people with borderline personality disorder also tend to view things in extremes, such as all good or all bad. They have difficulty trusting. They often have an irrational fear of other people's intentions. Inappropriate intense anger or problems controlling anger. This could also explain why Clarnell distrusted men, and why she thought that E.E., treating his son with some affection, would turn him gay. Despite E.E. having a stable and relatively lucrative job as an electrician, and being a present family man, if he did anything wrong, Clarnell saw him as all bad. Her difficulty trusting men also extended to her son. Unfortunately, her distrust of Ed only drove Ed to become more untrustworthy. After E.E. left, Clarnell moved herself and her 3 children to their new home in Helena, Montana. She began drinking habitually. The distrust of her quickly growing boy caused her to fear him. Instead of letting him sleep in his own room, Clarnell forced Ed to sleep in a dark, damp, cold basement without any windows. She sincerely believed that Ed would someday attack her or his sisters, so she locked the basement door to contain him. In an interview with a French journalist, Ed described the effect this had on his young mind. He said, quote, "Well, at a certain time of the evening, the family left the center room, the living room at the house. My mother and my sisters, or my sisters themselves, would go upstairs to bed, where I used to go to bed upstairs. I had to go down to the basement. As an 8-year-old child, I had a tough time differentiating the reason and why that was. Why am I going to the basement? I'm going to hell, and they're going to heaven. Earth is the living room. I'm going to deal with demons and monsters and ghosts and all the things that scare me, but they don't have to." End quote. The unfairness of the situation and the darkness of his environment drove Ed to further separate himself from the outside world. He began to daydream, imagining himself at the center of a dark fantasy. Some of those fantasies involved everyone else in the world dying, and Ed being left alone to do whatever he pleased. As the inner thoughts of 9-year-old Ed began to darken, so did his interactions with his siblings. While he mostly got along with his sisters, he began to convince them to play morbid games. After hearing the news about an execution of a criminal on death row via the gas chamber, Ed invented his own play version of the event. He had his sisters tie him to a chair and throw objects at him. They would leave, locking Ed in the room. He would then writhe on the floor, pretending to suffocate to death. Another game he played involved tightly wrapping Alan in a rug and seeing how long it would take her to wriggle out of it. They would compete to see who could wriggle out of the rug the fastest. But Ed just wasn't in it for the fun of the competition. He was absorbing what it would look like to see a woman in a helpless situation. His mother drank more and more, and her verbal abuse continued to be a constant torment for Ed. As Ed descended further into his imagined world, resentment and anger toward his mother was soon expressed through anger and violence. When Ed was only 10 years old, he grabbed the family cat, dragged it into the backyard, dug a hole, threw the cat inside, and buried it alive. He waited for the cat to suffocate. Then he dug the cat back up, grabbed a knife, and cut the cat's head off. He dissected the body and examined the cat's insides. He mounted the cat's head on a spike and admired his handiwork. Once his morbid curiosity was satisfied, he buried the cat's remains back in the hole. When Clarnell discovered the cat had gone missing, she rightfully blamed Ed. She hounded him about the cat every chance she got. Ed spoke less and less. Silence only caused his mother to grow more upset with him. He enjoyed the torment he had inflicted on the cat, and the pain the loss of the cat had caused his mother. This reinforced Ed's penchant for violence. His sister Susan teased him about a crush he had on one of his teachers. She told Ed he should just kiss her and see what happened. Ed replied by saying that the only way that he could kiss the teacher was if he killed her first. Ed had already proven his desire to commit violent acts, but this was the first time Ed's dark thoughts were also shown to be sexual in nature. It reflected his low self-esteem, and that he believed no girl would willingly kiss him. His 12-year-old mind was a terrifying place, but at the same time, full of heartbreak. When Ed was 13, the family got a new cat. The cat seemed to prefer Alan over Ed, and he decided the cat made the wrong choice. He cut it to pieces with a machete. He hid most of the cat's body outside, but he kept some select pieces in his closet as souvenirs. Weeks later, Clarnell discovered the cat's mutilated body parts when their rotting smell started to fill the house. Clarnell saw this as proof that her son was dangerous. She started to physically abuse him. She'd slap him when she thought his behavior was out of line. Unfortunately, Clarnell failed to understand her attempt at good parenting was a major factor in Ed's increasingly violent tendencies. Ed's hatred toward his mother continued to build until he just couldn't take it anymore. When Ed was 15, he ran away from home. He took buses and hitched rides down to Van Nuys, California, where his father lived. Having lived apart from his father for 6 years, Ed had grown to idolize his dad to a fanatical degree. He compared his dad to his favorite actor, John Wayne. Ed liked to think of his father as commanding an equivalent amount of authority and moral character. Ed believed when he returned to his father, he would welcome him in, like the Duke himself. However, things didn't go quite as well as Ed had hoped. Ed's arrival at EE's doorstep was a complete surprise. EE had a bombshell of his own to share. EE had remarried, and Ed now had a stepbrother, whom he never met. EE convinced his new wife to allow Ed to stay with him, but soon, Ed wore out his welcome. Ed was 6'4" at 15 years old. He towered over most people. He was a giant of an adolescent, a violent fantasy life, and a stark lack of social skills. Ed's stepmother and stepbrother found Ed to be intimidating. Ed treated his stepbrother poorly, and he felt that his father had purposefully replaced him. He would often refuse to participate in conversations, and instead glared at his stepbrother in silence. He didn't treat his stepmother with respect either. One night, his stepmother left the bathroom after showering, only to find Ed standing in the doorway. When she asked him to move, he simply stood, silent, staring at her breasts. She pushed past him to her room, only to have Ed follow her to her door. Ed's violent fantasies had grown increasingly more sexual. His impulse to prey on women was stronger than his ability to contemplate the consequences. Ed's stepmother rightfully felt frightened by his behavior. Later that day, she told EE that his son could no longer stay with them. Either EE would kick him out, or she was leaving. EE felt that he had already abandoned Ed once when he was younger, and that he was somewhat responsible for the way he turned out. He knew that he shouldn't have left Ed alone with his mother, but it was too late to do anything about that now. EE decided to take him to his own parents, Edmund and Maud Kemper. They would take over raising the boy. After only a few weeks of living with his dad, he was sent to live with his grandparents on their ranch in the mountains of Madera County. EE thought his grandparents might be the key to preventing disaster. Tragically, they would only fall prey to Ed's violent mind. Ed Kemper was 15 years old when he moved in with his grandparents, 72-year-old Edmund Kemper and 67-year-old Maud Kemper. Immediately upon arrival, Ed grew displeased with the move. Maud was a tough woman. She'd spent most of her life living on the ranch. She took no guff from her children or her grandchildren. She was confident in her abilities to parent, and she believed by taking Ed into their home, she could correct all the mistakes that Clarnell had made. Maud would insult Clarnell in front of Ed, while the two held a similar disdain for his mother. What could have served as a common ground only drove the two further apart. Ed, hearing Maud complain about his mother, only made him think of Maud as an extension of his mother. He thought Maud was equally controlling and domineering. Now, he saw even more similarities on how Maud treated his grandfather. Edmund Kemper Sr. was growing old and senile. Edmund I provided for Maud. He was a stable and quiet partner. As he grew older, he would often have lapses in memory and judgment, and it made it difficult for Maud to trust him. Maud would often chide the man, like a child. Unfortunately, Ed only saw how Maud treated Edmund Sr. in their old age, and he was wrong to assume she'd always treated him that way. As a result, Ed saw his grandparents' relationship as an extension of Maud's bitterness toward men, just like his mother's relationship with his father. Maud's relationship with the boy was strained from the beginning, but Edmund I tried to bond with the boy. He'd take Ed hunting, and even bought him his own rifle. Ed enjoyed going on hunting trips with his grandfather, but Edmund's ever-increasing senility interfered with his ability to make a connection with the boy. To make matters worse, Maud would never allow Ed to leave the ranch on his own. Maud worried Ed would cause more trouble if he was allowed to leave and be on his own in public. Ed spent most of his time alone on the ranch. He grew to hate living on the ranch more than he hated living with his mother. He felt trapped in his own personal hell by a doddering old dope and a nagging old hag. Ed began to act out. Maud would tell him not to stare at her, and he would give her a deathly stare. Maud refused to give Ed an allowance, so he stole money from her purse. Maud would tell him not to shoot any birds. Ed would immediately go out and shoot down the first bird he saw. Tensions between the two continued to escalate. Ed despised Maud. His violent fantasies began to focus on ending Maud's life. On August 27, 1964, 72-year-old Edmund Kemper I went to town to shop for groceries. 15-year-old Ed Kemper and 67-year-old Maud Kemper were on their own at the ranch. Ed stared at his grandmother. She began to chastise Ed for all of his usual offenses. Ed grew angry and started to yell back. Their argument became more intense than any they'd had before. Ed stormed out of the kitchen to blow off some steam, and as he marched out of there, his grandmother yelled at him, "Don't you shoot any birds." Ed walked out to the shed and grabbed his rifle. He loaded it, walked back into the kitchen, and stared at Maud. She yelled at him to put the rifle down. He shot her once in the head, and twice more in the back. But that wasn't enough. He still wasn't satisfied. He grabbed a kitchen knife and stabbed his grandmother with reckless abandon. Once he got his fill, he dragged her body to the bedroom and put her on the bed. He stared at her corpse, exhilarated. He hadn't shot any birds. She had to be happy with him now. Ed Sr. pulled up into the driveway. Ed looked at the front door and then looked at his grandmother's corpse. While Ed enjoyed the sight of her permanently closed mouth, he knew it would be too horrid for his grandfather to bear. So he went out to his truck, snuck up behind his grandfather, and shot him in the head. Ed looked at his grandfather's corpse. He hadn't enjoyed that as much as he'd enjoyed killing his grandmother, but he felt like it had to be done, and he was doing his grandfather a favor. The only question now was, what to do next? Ed was 15. He didn't know how to drive, and he was alone at the ranch miles away from the nearest town. He didn't have a job. He didn't have friends. He had no idea what to do. Ed's only resource was the house phone. Ed realized that if he wanted to leave the ranch, he had to call someone. He couldn't call his father. He'd just killed his father's parents. There was only one person in the world he could call. Clarnell picked up the phone, and her 15-year-old son told her everything. Her greatest fears had been realized. Everything she suspected about her son, everything that made her paranoid about the darkness inside his heart, everything she'd been trying to snuff out, had finally exploded in a violent rage. She urged her son to turn himself in to the police. It was his only option. Ed calmly agreed. He hung up the phone and called the local police station. The police arrived at the ranch and found Ed waiting for them outside. They were surprised to see that the 6'4" youth was calm, cordial, and cooperated with their every request. He told the police everything that he'd done. When they asked him why he did it, Ed said, "I just wanted to know what it'd be like to kill Grandma." They asked him why he killed his grandfather too, and he said, "I didn't want my grandfather to know that his wife had died. He only killed his grandfather to spare him the pain of knowing what his grandson had done." Ed was taken to jail to await his court date. Psychiatrists were brought in to analyze Ed's mental state. They were shocked at how well-spoken and cooperative he was. They were also shocked by how clearly Ed described how he did the crime. The court's psychiatrist simply couldn't understand how a boy like this could commit such a heinous murder. They declared that the only way a 15-year-old could brutally murder someone is if the boy was criminally insane. They diagnosed Ed Kemper with paranoid schizophrenia. According to the Mayo Clinic, schizophrenia is a serious mental disorder where people interpret reality abnormally. They can suffer from hallucinations, often hearing voices or seeing things that are not there. Some of the psychiatrists interpreted Ed's vivid, violent fantasies as signs of hallucinations. The actions and words of a schizophrenic can make little to no sense, and their thinking does not connect logically from one point to the next. The court psychiatrist saw the murder of his grandparents as behavior that made little to no sense. At the time, the court psychiatrist saw Ed's hatred of his grandmother's nagging and his disdain for his mother's treatment of him as evidence of paranoid delusions. He didn't know that these were accurate portrayals of his mother and grandmother's personalities. The court psychiatrist saw enough evidence to rule Ed criminally insane. He won a plea of not guilty by reason of insanity. Ed was sentenced to an indefinite amount of time at Tuscadero State Hospital, a maximum security mental health facility. While doctors worked to cure Ed of his violent tendencies, His stay at Tuscadero only helped Ed become a more violent and more proficient killer. The prison introduced structure into his life, and because he was a minor, he was able to continue his education. With the new rigid environment and free from his mother's interferences, Ed began to excel in his coursework. He was polite and well-behaved. The doctors began to suspect there was something special about this murderous teen. The psychologists and psychiatrists in charge of Ed's rehab decided to see exactly how smart Ed really was. They gave him an IQ test, and they were shocked at how well he did on his first try. The average person has a score of 100. Ed scored incredibly high, with an IQ of 136. Only 2% of the people in the world have an IQ above 130. Ed Kemper was intellectually gifted. After a few months, the psychologist tested him again. He scored 145. Only 0.25% of people in the world can boast that. Kemper was a bona fide genius. The psychiatrist believed that their diagnosis of schizophrenia was wrong. They took a closer look and discovered that he displayed almost no symptoms of schizophrenia. He didn't suffer from delusions or disorganized speech. In the haste to go to trial, the court psychiatrist had dreadfully misdiagnosed Ed. After weeks of intense deliberation, the psychologists gave Ed a new diagnosis: passive-aggressive type personality trait disturbance. Passive-aggressive disorder is defined by a pattern of behaviors where negative feelings are expressed in an indirect way. Most people have some passive-aggressive tendencies, but psychiatrists believe that Ed displayed those tendencies to a pathological degree. Basically, when they're asked to do something that they don't like, or they're asked to buy someone they don't like, they will outwardly agree to the task and just not do it. When confronted about failing to fulfill their obligations, they'll often make excuses for their behavior or claim they simply forgot. They exaggerate their own misfortune and believe they're misunderstood by the people around them. 15-year-old Ed complained about almost everyone in his life, but he often ignored the importance of his own behavior. His new diagnosis made Ed and the doctors optimistic. A criminally dangerous paranoid schizophrenic at the time had little chance of successful treatment. However, a person with passive-aggressive disorder can be treated if they really want to change. Ed realized he might be released if he could convince the psychiatrist that he's made real progress toward sanity. So he began to cooperate with the psychiatrists wholeheartedly. While the doctors thought they were curing Ed's violent mind, in reality, Ed was simply learning how to hide his violent tendencies. He kept his behavior in line with his doctor's expectations, but he continued to fantasize about sexual violence in what he called his vicious world. Ed became a model prisoner and a model patient. He followed orders to a T, and he didn't get into any fights with the inmates. The psychiatrist felt like the young man could use some responsibility, and they decided to give him some work that he could be proud of. They started to let him assist with their psychological study of other inmates. At first, the doctors had Ed do clerical work. They would have him take files from place to place in the hospital. Later on, Ed admitted that while he wasn't supposed to look at the other inmates' files, he used the delivery runs as an opportunity to learn how to cheat the system. Ed began studying the files. He memorized the questions, and he looked at the psychiatrist's notes to see what answers they liked and didn't like. Instead of using his intellect to gain a better understanding of himself, he used it to gain a better understanding of the psychiatric system. He liked his work, and he eventually wanted to be more involved. The psychiatrist allowed him to sit in on interviews with other inmates. He listened to murderers, sex offenders, arsonists, and psychopaths relive their crimes. Ed absorbed their stories, remembering their tips and tricks. One specific thing he remembered learning from the interviews with rapists was that it was better to kill your victim. That way, there'd be no witnesses left to go to the police. Ed became fascinated with the criminal mind. He took extreme pride in the work that he was doing. After a few years, psychiatrists began allowing Ed to conduct psychiatric exams on his own. Ed even claimed that he created a new portion of the personality exam on the overt hostility scale, a measure of how openly antagonistic a person was willing to be with those around him. The psychiatrists were so impressed with Ed that they also encouraged him to join the United States Junior Chamber, a civic society dedicated to training people in leadership skills. The chamber had such notable people as Gerald Ford, Richard Nixon, Ronald Reagan, Bill Clinton, and Bill Gates. Ed Kemper was proud to be a member of that group. By the time Ed was 20, he stood a hulking 6'9". The psychiatrists believed that he was mostly a gentle giant. was that he still had hatred for his mother. Ed had successfully hidden his violent fantasies for years, but he couldn't hide his persistent disdain for Clarell. But no system is perfect, and all patients still have things they need to work through when they're released from their respective mental institutions. Despite Ed's desire for matricide, the psychiatrist deemed Ed Kemper ready for release. On December 18, 1969, on his 21st birthday, Ed was released and put in the care of the California State Authority. They gave him some parole requirements and said that his continued freedom depended on him enrolling in college courses. The CSA was in charge of setting up Ed with a place to live. Even though he was 21, he'd spent the last 6 years in prison. He didn't have the knowledge necessary for acquiring a job and his own residence. The psychiatrist gave the CSA only one strong recommendation. Ed Kemper should not be returned back to his mother. Ed's stepbrother claims that E.E. Kemper vowed to kill his own son if he ever saw him near his family again. Whether he would have done it or not is debatable, but he wasn't going to live with his father. They also asked his sisters, but they both refused. They looked into putting him in a halfway house, but at the time, the halfway houses in California were at maximum capacity. The CSA finally presented Ed with two options: move back in with his mother, or return to Tuscadero. Even though he hated his mother, he still secretly longed for her approval and her love. Clarell's life had changed since Ed was imprisoned. She'd gotten remarried and divorced, then remarried a third time and divorced a third time. The fact that she was in 3 unsuccessful marriages also lends credence to the idea that she too suffered from borderline personality disorder. She had proven herself unable to maintain a healthy relationship with any man, whereas she had perfectly fine relationships with their daughters and female friends. She had moved to Montana to Santa Cruz, California, where she got a job as an administrative assistant. The job paid well, and she was fairly good at it. Ed had hoped moving back in with his mother might turn out to be a good thing. Sources report they had a good relationship for about a month. Ed enrolled in community college, in line with his parole. He was shocked the world had moved on past him. Santa Cruz had become a hotbed for the freewheeling, anti-authoritarian, and somewhat chaotic philosophy of the 1960s. Ed decided he wanted to become a police officer. He respected the police and their authority. Unfortunately, Ed's home life began to descend into chaos. His short-lived peace with his mother gave way to their old dynamic. He said, quote, "My mother and I started right in on horrendous battles. Just horrid battles. Violent and vicious. I've never been in such a vicious battle with anyone. It would go to fists with a man, but this was my mother, and I couldn't stand the idea of my mother and I doing these things. She insisted on it, and just over stupid things. I remember one roof raiser was over whether I should have my teeth cleaned or not." End quote. Ed's mental health degraded quickly. His violent fantasies would soon become too harsh and too disturbing to ignore. Soon, Ed was consumed by thoughts of murdering his own mother. This has been Episode 6, Part 1 of the Killer Bee True Crime Podcast. Thank you for listening, and God bless.